we begin our spiritual gathering, I want to take just a few minutes to share some invitations and some announcements with us while we're gathered. On Friday evening, we invite all of you to join us for our informal, about once a month spiritual gathering that happens called the Dinner Project. We gather at 6 o'clock on Friday evening. We share a simple evening meal together, share a short spiritual gathering that's geared for all ages, and then engage in a project with one another. This month, coming into Valentine's Day, our theme is love, and we're going to participate in a series of activities about how we express that value in our lives. We've been pursuing these words that you find on the screen and on our wall, words that represent the values that Meewasin Valley United Church in Saskatoon embraced. Meewasin Valley United Church is now Spiritual Seekers United in Community, SSUC Saskatoon, our satellite partners. And we have been reflecting on our shared roots, and today we continue that as we reflect on open-mindedness. We celebrate and honor this land on which we gather, and with deep respect and gratitude, we honor that it has been ancestral home for Cree and Métis peoples, our Indigenous neighbors, and we are partners, those of us who have come to this land generations ago or just days, weeks, months, a few years ago. We are partners all in Treaty 6, and as we gather, we remind ourselves about the work of reconciliation. And a very warm welcome to each of you in this circle, those of you who've made your way through the deep freeze of Edmonton to warm this space with each other. We welcome you. And we welcome those of you who stayed safely in the warmth of your home to be with us here this morning, and we're glad you're gathered with us online, and we welcome you to this experience of our spiritual gathering. And those of you beyond Edmonton who are joining us online, we're grateful for your presence, grateful for your support, and we welcome each and every one as we remind ourselves that we are a community, that you have a place, whether you are in this room, whether you've ever been here before, whether you haven't been here in a long time, or whether you gather regularly to help hold the rim of this circle for this community. We celebrate who we are together, the great diversity of color and culture and language and traditions, of sexual orientations and gender identities, of all the ages and stages we find ourselves in life. We come together to light this candle a symbol of our common and shared origin in the stars, a symbol of our common and shared quest for life with depth and purpose and meaning, and our lifelong quest to see light in one another, to honor light in one another, to respect the light that we each bring in the uniqueness of who we are. And so we gather, knowing that deep in our hearts, we share common dreams, common visions, common purpose, common story. And so we sing ourselves into this time together.
I almost forgot what time it is. It's a time for all ages. Let me put this on. Anyone who wants to come and hear a story is welcome. Good morning, everyone. Well, I want to tell you, I have this favorite pizza restaurant that we go to, and I always order the same thing. Always order the same thing. And sometimes the people I'm with, they don't even need to ask me what I want. They know. Sometimes that's kind of nice. And then sometimes I think, I wonder if I should try something else. And then I look at the menu and I think about it, and then I chicken out at the last minute and I get what I always get. Can I read you a story? It's called Chester's Way. It's a little bit like this, trying new things, doing new things. This is a book by Kevin Henkes. Chester had his own way of doing things. He always cut his sandwiches diagonally. He always got out of bed on the same side, and he never left the house without double knotting his shoes. Chester always had the same things for breakfast: toast with jam and peanut butter. And he always carried a miniature first aid kit in his back pocket, just in case. "You definitely have a mind of your own," said Chester's mother. "That's one way to put it," said Chester's father. Chester's best friend Wilson was exactly the same way. That's why they were best friends. Chester wouldn't play baseball unless Wilson played, and they never swung at the first pitch or slid head first. Wilson wouldn't ride his bike unless Chester wanted to, and they always used hand signals. If Chester was hungry, Wilson was too, but they rarely ate between meals. Oh my goodness. "Some days I can't tell those two apart," said Wilson's mother. "Me either," said Wilson's father.
Directly eating ice cream.
Yeah. Chester and Wilson, Wilson and Chester, that's the way it was. They loved to go on picnics. Once when Wilson accidentally swallowed a watermelon seed and cried because he was afraid that a watermelon plant would grow inside of him, Chester swallowed one too. "Don't worry," said Chester. "Now if you grow a watermelon plant, I'll grow one." Chester duplicated his Christmas list every year and gave a copy to Wilson because they always wanted the same things anyway.
We have to receive it because they're going to have, because it's Halloween.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, here's Halloween. Yeah, for Halloween they always dressed as things that went together, like salt and pepper shakers, 2 mittens on a string, ham and eggs. "They really are 2 peas in a pod," said Chester's mother. "Looks like it. Look, one year they were 2 peas." In spring, Chester and Wilson shared the same umbrella. In winter, they never threw snowballs at each other. In fall, they raked leaves together. And in summer, they reminded each other to wear sunscreen so they wouldn't burn. Chester and Wilson, Wilson and Chester, that's just the way it was. And then, Lily moved into the neighborhood. Lily had her own way of doing things. Look, she says, "I'm Lily, I'm the queen, I like everything." She wore Band-Aids all over her arms and legs and looked brave. She talked backwards to herself sometimes so no one would know what she was saying. And she never left the house without one of her nifty disguises. Lily waved at all the cars that passed by, even if she didn't know who was in them. And she always carried a loaded squirt gun in her back pocket just in case. "She definitely has a mind of her own," said Chester. "That's one way to put it," said Wilson. When Lily asked Chester and Wilson to play, they said they were busy. When she called them up on the phone, they disguised their voices and said, "We're not home." If Lily was walking on one side of the street, Chester and Wilson crossed to the other side, and they hid behind a tree. "She's something else," said Chester. "Looks like it," said Wilson. One day while Chester and Wilson were practicing their hand signals, some older boys rode by popping wheelies. They circled Chester and Wilson and yelled personal remarks. Ooh. Chester and Wilson didn't know what to do. And just when they were about to give up hope, a fierce-looking cat with horrible fangs jumped out of the bushes and frightened the older boys away. "Are you who I think you are?" Chester asked the cat. "Of course," the cat replied. "Thank you, Lily," said Chester. "You're welcome, Chester," said Lily. "Thank you, Lily," said Wilson. "You're welcome, Wilson," said Lily. Oh, my goodness. "I'm glad you were wearing a disguise," said Chester, "and I'm glad you had your squirt gun." "I always do," said Lily, "just in case." Afterward, Chester invited Lily over for lunch. "You have a Muscle Mouse cup?" said Lily. "Of course," said Chester. "I do too," said Lily. "Same here," said Wilson. Chester and Wilson cut their sandwiches diagonally. Lily asked Chester's mother if she had a cookie cutter, and she made stars and flowers and bells. That's neat, said Chester. Wow, said Wilson. I've never had a sandwich cut into stars and bells and flowers. Have you? No? Wow, that's amazing. That night, Lily invited Chester and Wilson to sleep over. You have a nightlight, said Chester. Of course, said Lily. I do too, said Chester. Same here, said Wilson. Well, they were finding out all kinds of things. Chester and Wilson wanted toast with jam and peanut butter for breakfast. Boring, said Lily. Try this instead. It looks like toast with strawberries and orange slices and Cheerios made into a face, doesn't it? This is good, said Chester. Wow, said Wilson. And after that, Lily asked Chester and Wilson to play, and they said yes.
I think you said no before.
Right. They said no, but now they said yes. When she called them up on the phone, they had pleasant conversations. And if Lily was walking on one side of the street, Chester and Wilson waved and ran to catch up with her. Chester and Wilson taught Lily hand signals, and she taught them how to pop wheelies. Lily taught Chester and Wilson how to talk backwards, and they taught her how to double knot her shoes. Some days I can't tell those three apart, said Lily's mother. Me either, said Lily's father. Chester and Wilson and Lily. Lily and Wilson and Chester. That's just the way it was. And for Halloween, they dressed as the three blind mice. And for Christmas, Lily gave Chester and Wilson nifty disguises, and they gave her a box of multicolored shoelaces, extra long, so she could double knot them. They all loved going on picnics, and Chester and Wilson told Lily about how they had each swallowed a watermelon seed once, and Lily swallowed 3 of them. I'll grow a watermelon plant for each of us, she said. So in spring, Chester and Wilson and Lily shared the same umbrella. In winter, they never threw snowballs at each other. In fall, they raked the leaves together. And in summer, they reminded each other to wear sunscreen so they wouldn't burn. Chester and Wilson and Lily, Lily and Wilson and Chester, that's the way it was. Oh, it was so hard for them at first, but I'm so glad they gave it a try. They opened their mind and they opened their heart to Lily, and Lily became a very good friend. It is very hard at first to try new things and to say hello to someone new. But Chester and Wilson and Lily tell us that there's some great things that might happen if we do.
A reading from a collection of writings passed down to us in the first century, from the Gospel of John, which was written very late in the first century or early in the second. In chapter 4, we have a conversation between Jesus and a woman in Samaria. Jesus came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that the patriarch Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. His disciples had gone to the city to buy food when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, "Could you give me a drink?" And she questioned him how it was that he, a Jew, would ask a drink of her, a woman from Samaria. Was he not taught that his people have no regard for her people? They share nothing in common. And Jesus went on to answer her, "If you had asked me for a drink, I would have given you living water." But the woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well and with his children and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But there is water that is living, that gushes up like a spring within. This is the water I would give you." She asked that he give her this water so she wouldn't have to keep coming to this well to draw water. Jesus invited her to go home and get her husband and return. But she told him that she didn't have a husband. And Jesus said, "Yes, I know. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you have now isn't your husband." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Judeans say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Truly, the sacred is found anywhere in spirit and truth." In this ancient story, may we find wisdom for our living.
We're going to watch a brief video clip that was done several years ago at an alternative Memorial Day celebration in Israel, Palestine. Memorial Day is the day in which Israel memorializes those who have died in wars. In this clip, we will meet combatants for peace, those who have been former Israeli soldiers who fulfilled their compulsory military duty and recognized that it was not the way to peace. It was the way to continue an unlawful occupation. Joining them are members of the Family Forum, those parents and family members who have lost loved ones, those from Palestinian communities who have lost their children, and those from Israeli communities who have lost their children. So we watch this brief clip to hear a little bit of their encounters with one another.
They used to be soldiers in the Israeli army or members of Palestinian organizations who had perpetrated terrorist attacks in Israel. They decided to abandon warfare and instead choose to become combatants for peace. On Memorial Day Eve this week, they met in Tel Aviv with the Parents' Circle of Bereaved Families in remembrance of those who fell in combat and to help stop the bloody harvest on both sides. Aydin Beria served in the Israeli army for 10 years and became a captain during the Gaza war. He decided that something was deeply wrong, so he joined the organization Combatants for Peace and began meeting with Palestinians.
In one point I wanted to know the other side, to reach to whom I believed used to be my enemies before. And it was joint processes, I would say. In one side, understanding that military service is the cause of the violence, and on the other hand, the understanding that we should give up violence.
A bereaved father who lost his daughter 15 years ago when she was only 14 joined the Israeli and Palestinian Parents' Circle of Bereaved Families. He tries to convince teenagers and adults to support peace.
The reason why I get out of bed in the morning is to go and tell people that it isn't a predestined fate. It's not written anywhere that we should go on killing each other, and the only way to stop it is by dialogue.
Silwan is a suburb in East Jerusalem and an area for clashes between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian residents. But there are also people there who are identifying with the pain felt on the other side.
We came here Palestinian to share the pain of the Israelian like the Israelis sharing our pain. It's the same. Who died from the post side is the same. The mother she had lost her son, it's the same. The crying, the pain, the happiness, there's no difference between a Jewish family and Arab family.
It wasn't easy for them to meet people from the other side and abandon prejudice. They had fear of confronting those who they used to see only through the barrel of a gun.
I stood on the side and gazed at the people, and suddenly it hit me like lightning. It was the first time I saw Palestinians as human beings. I blushed with shame. I was 47 years old, and it was the first time I saw Palestinians as human beings and not as titles of newspaper articles. I remember seeing a Palestinian woman, an elderly bereft woman dressed in traditional black clothes, and she had a photograph of her 6-year-old child right here, the same way my wife carries our daughter's name here.
Now Elhanan lectures all over Israel and the Palestinian Authority, including in schools.
When I stand in front of a class of Palestinian or Israeli children and one child at the back row nods his head like this, it's a miracle. I saved one drop of blood. In Judaism, a drop of blood is like a whole world. These children are so hateful, Israelis and Palestinians, who need to break a very thick wall of fear and despair.
People who attended the event believe there is hope for peace, in spite of the tense situation in the area.
People from both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, bereaved families, ex-combatants, we all came here to mourn our dead on the one hand, but offer something for the future: hope, reconciliation, mutual act, mutual work. All of these you can find here.
NTD News, Tel Aviv, Israel.
Every once in a while, we overhear a conversation we know is part of an old conversation. It might be a perennial argument our parents carried on in chapters over their marriage. Or it might be the long conversation in our country between Francophones and Anglophones, or between settlers and those indigenous to the land, or competing narratives of conflicts that are long and deep. These conversations that never really have a conclusion, we just keep living into them and out of them. When I tune into that story that John's Gospel gives us about a most unusual conversation between a first-century Jewish man and a first-century Samaritan woman, I feel like I'm eavesdropping on one of those old conversations. A conversation that began long before either of these storied characters broke silence with speech. Suppose for a moment it's not a story about something that happened in history. Suppose it's a story created by a first-century community to teach something about who Jesus was for them and the kind of community they were becoming as they sought to live into his teachings. How would it be if we heard this as a story about Jesus, and thus a parable about what the way of Jesus is really about? Like all good stories that Jesus told, this parable about him is like a multifaceted Rubik's Cube. The story gives us this surprising conversation set in a very stereotypical place, in the ancient Middle Eastern world, the well was where women went to get water for their families and their flocks. And the well was where men went to get a wife. If you were a first-century male of the time, you had only one reason to go to the well, and it certainly wasn't to do women's work, like drawing water. The ancient audience who first heard this story would be expecting a story about a mating ritual. You know, boy meets girl at the well, and then along comes marriage and the baby carriage. It's as predictable to them as a knock-knock joke is to us. The story places Jesus and this unnamed woman at the edge of a famous well that most Jewish men of the first century wouldn't be found anywhere near. And in order for the story to put Jesus there, he would have had to intentionally choose not to take the 9-day detour along the Jordan River to go from the Galilee to Jerusalem in the south. Most of his contemporaries would take that longer route in order to avoid crossing this hostile territory of his people's ancient enemy, the Samaritans. And instead, this story puts him as a suspicious intruder with a Galilean accent, smack dab in the middle of the heartland of Samaria. As a Jewish male from Nazareth, even today, he'd be conspicuously out of place. In the first century, as a Jewish man, you wouldn't go there because it's in Samaria. In the 21st century, a Jewish Israeli wouldn't go there because it's in the Palestinian territory of the West Bank in the Arab city of Nablus. But in the world of the story, he's a first century Jewish man sitting beside a well named after one of his most famous ancestors. And she's a Samaritan woman, standing beside the well, sacred to her people, undoubtedly in the hottest part of the day. It's a well where many have found their mate, including their shared ancestor Jacob, who got not just one, but 2 wives at this well. The story has Jesus ask her for a drink of water. And of course, she's surprised by this. Here he is, a Jewish male, hitting on her. He's looking for a wife, not a drink of water, in her mind. And then there's this little parenthesis in the story that kind of says it all. Our Bible tucks this little secret of the story in brackets. It says, Jews have nothing in common with Samaritans. Really? It seems they have a few things in common. They certainly share a mutual suspicion of each other and a hostility toward one another. And they stereotype and profile each other. And they each think they're right and the other's wrong. No one hearing this story in the first century needed that little cue. They understood they were natural enemies. They have something else in common. They're both thirsty. That's why they're there. But he's got nothing with which to draw water, not even a cup to drink from. And she's clearly surprised that he's asking for her help to quench his thirst. Whatever the differences in their feasts and festivals, their priests and their prayers, their stories and their myths, they meet on the common ground of their thirst. And then they venture into the common ground of conversation. Sacred ground. But then the story takes a very strange twist. when Jesus invites her to go home and get her husband and bring him back to the well with her. And with our 21st century Western ears, we hear morality talk. And we miss the heartbreak in understanding what it is that she has had 5 husbands and the man she's with now is not her husband. And we miss how these characters moved from their entrenched hostilities and their old arguments of their ancestors, and their hearts broke open to each other. Because for a woman to be married 5 times and now be with a man who was not her husband was to discover how wounded she had been by life. That her husband had died. And his surviving brother had to marry her. And that happened not once, but for every one of his surviving brothers. Taking her on as a social obligation. You outlive your husband, and then you outlive, in sequence, 4 of his brothers. And then you're even more vulnerable as a woman in a male-dominated society. We're not talking about her love life here. We're talking about a loveless life. And we're seeing how life has broken her heart again and again. And how this young Jewish man, who'd known his own share of rejection, he'd been run out of his hometown. How his heart opened to the vulnerability of her experience. And their minds followed their hearts in opening. And they opened beyond that old, tired conversation, their people's differences about where the right place to worship was and what the right books that really formed their scriptures were, and how their priests should do their rituals. They open beyond those old, tired conversations into a shared experience of their common humanity. And eventually, into the openness of discerning that the sacred can be found anywhere and everywhere by those who seek it honestly and with true spirit. Story's a reminder that our minds seldom open first. It usually takes a broken, open heart to open a mind. Our minds are opened by our hearts being moved with empathy, or by our capacity to see the other just like us, or to recognize what it would be to be in their situation, in their sandals, in their moccasins. And isn't that exactly the experience that Rami Elhanan shared? In acknowledging his deep embarrassment and shame, that he had reached 47 years of age, an intelligent, educated, informed Jewish Israeli citizen, and he had never in his life regarded a Palestinian as a human being until his heart was broken open. Until he recognized the grief of a Palestinian mother whose 6-year-old child had been killed in their shared conflict was just as identical to the grief of his wife, they who had lost their 14-year-old daughter to this conflict. Each mother carried their daughter's picture in a locket around their neck. Imagine the courage it takes for Israeli and Palestinian parents to sit down together, to sit in a circle with your perceived enemy and find a shared humanity as parents who have each lost a child in a conflict that has gone on between your people for generations. And imagine the courage it takes for these parents who have only known each other in the deep suspicion of being enemies to meet on the common ground of grief. Palestinian parents who've lost a child to an Israeli soldier's bullet, to sit in a circle and share their deepest pain with Israeli parents who have lost a child to a Palestinian suicide bomber. And in that meeting, to discover one another as human beings whose heartbreak and tears is more alike than they would have ever dreamed. Their minds broken open to the possibilities of peace because their hearts have been broken open to each other. In the ancient story of Jesus and the woman, the characters each came to that conversation rooted in the old conversations, the old arguments, the old debates between their religious traditions. But their conversation found its way to touch the essence of their common thirst and their shared humanity. And he left that conversation without a bucket or a cup. And she set down her jars, and she left without her containers. Maybe a sign that they had left at this well their prejudices and their perceptions and their narratives and their preconceived ideas, their opinions, the stuff that had closed their minds to one another and closed their hearts to one another. It's a story that invites us to be rooted in open-mindedness and to unburden ourselves from the buckets and jars and containers that keep us from sharing life-giving water with one another, and to abandon our preoccupation with obsolete containers and old conversations, and instead become a community of practice where we can learn from one another, where living water is to be found. At this table, we celebrate the blessed mess of mysteries that link us to each other and to all that is. In this ritual, we honor the long story of life, of earth opening to feed us, our gratitude for the solar energy that gives us grain and grape, and for these symbols that remind us of our shared hunger and thirst. We meet at this table remembering how the early community of Jesus sustained their hope and their commitment to each other by sharing meals, feeding the hungry, caring for one another, breaking down barriers between Jews and Gentiles, between men and women, and treating one another with a newfound respect. We come to this table as an expression of our shared hunger and thirst. We come in solidarity with all who are hungry and thirsty in body and mind and spirit. And we share this ritual as an expression of a subversive commitment to challenge the systems that allow hunger to be acceptable and thirst to be inevitable, and ignorance of our shared humanity to close our hearts and our minds to one another. And we share the bread of solidarity and the cup of subversiveness as a way of renewing our commitment to be the human expression of Earth community, to compassion and respect, to freedom and possibility, to open-mindedness and broken open-heartedness. You don't need to be a member of this or any church to be welcome, to share in these symbols, to participate in this ritual. You don't have to ascribe to any particular doctrine or creed. These are the gifts of a good earth, and they're for all of us. If you hunger for a more compassionate world, if you're thirsty for a more just world, and want to live in ways to help that happen, come, eat and drink together, or use this time in the company of music to find whatever it is that your spirit needs most. And so, we celebrate simple gifts, the bread of solidarity, the cup of subversiveness. Friends, we go to let the light of love shine through us, to shine through our broken open hearts and our opened minds, to bring to a hurting world our vulnerability and our care, And so we go with one another to let our light shine.